Burbank, California, March 5, 2006, p.m. The Boeing 737 cuts through the gray sky at 200 knots, 180 knots, still 170 knots, too fast, too heavy, too late. The captain presses the brakes with all the force he has, but the mathematics are unforgiving. 4,150 feet of runway remaining, 4,700 feet needed to stop. The concrete wall ahead grows with each passing second. Inside the cockpit, a voice breaks the tense silence. My fault. And then, in an admission that will echo for years to come, well, there goes my career. The captain has 8 seconds before impact. How is it possible that an experienced pilot, flying a route he knows like the back of his hand, ends up crashing through a gas station at 40 miles per hour? Why did 2 competent pilots ignore all the safety warnings? Who's really to blame when an airline's culture pushes its pilots toward increasingly risky decisions? And the question nobody wants to ask, how many other Southwest flights were flying exactly like this that same day? This is another story about warning signs ignored for years, my friend. Signs that were flashing red right in front of everyone. I'm Captain Sergio Marchetti, a commercial pilot for over 25 years. What you're about to watch is this story from a pilot's point of view, based on official NTSB reports, cockpit recordings, and testimonies from those who were there. Welcome aboard. Let's talk about Southwest Airlines. In March 2000, it was already the 4th largest airline in the United States and held an impressive title, the world's largest Boeing 737 operator. More than 800 of these aircraft flying through American skies, my friend. And one of them was N666HSW, a classic 737-300 that was about to star in one of the most revealing stories about organizational culture in aviation. Burbank Airport, officially Hollywood Burbank Airport, is located just 11 miles north of downtown Los Angeles, wedged into the southeastern corner of the San Fernando Valley. And when I say wedged, I really mean it. There's a 3,000-foot mountain immediately east of the field and the Hollywood Hills, rising to 1,700 feet just to the south. It's a challenging airport by nature. Burbank has 2 runways, runway 08 to 26, aligned from west to east, and runway 1533, which runs from northwest to southeast. But here's the problem. Because of the rugged terrain, only runway 08 had an instrument landing system, the ILS. The opposite runway, 26, was practically impossible for commercial jets to use because of the hills just 3 nautical miles from the threshold. So if the tailwind was too strong on 08, the alternative was runway 33. Oh, and there's another important detail. Van Nuys Airport, one of the busiest general aviation fields in the world, is just 6 nautical miles west of the runway 08 threshold. That's more than 230,000 annual movements there, more than Burbank itself. This means commercial jets need to stay at 3,000 feet or higher when passing over Van Nuys, unless they're on an instrument approach. Keep this information in mind, because it's going to be important later. Now let's meet the protagonists of this story. The captain, 52 years old, an Air Force veteran with experience in corporate jets and commercial aviation. He'd been working at Southwest since 1988. That's 12 years with the company, my friend. He had accumulated 11,000 flight hours, almost all of them in the Boeing 737. His colleagues described him as an average pilot with a friendly, easygoing attitude. He lived in Las Vegas, so he knew that Las Vegas-Burbank route like few others. He'd flown it dozens, maybe hundreds of times. The first officer, 43 years old with 12 years of Air Force experience before joining Southwest 3 years earlier. He had 5,000 total hours, half of them in the 737. He was considered an above-average pilot by captains who had flown with him. Interesting detail, he still flew F-16s in the Air Force Reserves and had done a combat flight just 2 days before this incident. A competent guy, no doubt. Both were well rested. This would be the first leg of a 3-day, 5-flight sequence. A bread-and-butter route for these guys. But that day, nothing was really normal. Las Vegas, famous for its hot, dry weather, was facing thunderstorms. That's right, thunderstorms in Las Vegas, so strong there was even a wind shear alert at McCarran Airport. Extremely rare there. And those storms extended all along the route to Southern California. The aircraft that was supposed to operate Flight 1455 had been stuck in Los Angeles for almost 2 hours because of those storms. The scheduled departure time was 2:45 p.m. But when the pilots arrived at the gate at McCarran, the plane hadn't even shown up yet. You know when you're waiting for that delay to resolve itself? Well, that's what happened. The aircraft only appeared at 4:30 p.m., and here begins the first pressure of the day. Make up for lost time. The crew boarded the 137 passengers and 3 flight attendants at an impressive speed. At 4:50 p.m., just 20 minutes after the plane had arrived at the gate, Flight 1455 was already taxiing to the runway. As a 737 pilot, I guarantee you, that's very fast. It's that rush, my friend, where you kind of skip some mental checks because everyone's in a hurry. During the performance calculations, the pilots noticed something strange. The airplane was unusually heavy for such a short flight. They had added 3,000 pounds of extra fuel beyond normal, enough to fly all the way back to Las Vegas if they couldn't land in Burbank. This meant they would be close to maximum landing weight when they reached their destination. Keep this in mind. Heavy airplane, rushed crew, storms ahead. Takeoff is normal, with the captain as pilot flying and the first officer monitoring. They climb without problems, level off at cruise altitude and begin flying southwest over the Mojave Desert. During the flight, they request deviations around some thunderstorm cells and encounter mild turbulence. Nothing major, you know. We do this all the time. Our weather radar detects those cells easily enough. The cockpit voice recorder captures the pilots chatting about their careers, about a United Airlines flight that nearly struck terrain after takeoff from San Francisco in 1988, which was now being used as a training scenario. And then they start talking about what to expect at Burbank. The captain comments that there was a report of an 18-knot tailwind on runway 08, so they'd probably have to land on runway 33 since he couldn't even recall ever using runway 26. He gives a quick briefing where he anticipates a visual approach to 33, flap 40 configuration, and repeats the local altimeter setting. Pay attention to that briefing because it's going to change completely in a bit. At 6:02 p.m., the crew is handed over to the woodland sector of Sokol-Trakon, a massive combined air traffic control facility that funnels aircraft into numerous airports throughout the Los Angeles area. Immediately after establishing contact, the controller tells them to expect an ILS approach to runway 08. Look at the irony. They had just prepared for runway 33, and now they're back to Air 08. For the captain, this must have seemed great. After all, the ILS approach to 08 was much more familiar than a visual to 33. In his mind, the task had just gotten easier. Let me be crystal clear about something here. Briefings are fundamental for shared situational awareness in the cockpit, and the shorter and vaguer they are, the more dangerous they become. Meanwhile, Flight 1455 is located about 21 nautical miles north of the runway 08 threshold, southwest of the Palmdale VOR radio beacon. Normally, when inbound traffic reaches this area, the Woodland Sector Controller gives radar vectors to intercept the runway 08 approach at a distance between 10 to 15 nautical miles from the threshold. ATC procedures require the controller to provide vectors that result in an intercept angle of 30 degrees or less. Why? So the crew doesn't have to turn so sharply to catch the final approach course, which could cause the aircraft to overshoot the centerline. Normally this means sending the aircraft quite far west before vectoring them back for a shallower intercept. But sometimes when traffic is tight, the controller uses a steeper angle closer to the runway. At 6:03 p.m., there's another southwest ahead, Flight 1713, which has already received vectors to intercept the approach course 12 nautical miles out. A business jet is also coming in from the northwest, but it's still far out. The controller's plan is to slot Flight 1455 in between these two flights. But here's the problem. If he vectors 1455 too far west before turning them back, the business jet will catch up. So the controller decides to start vectoring the flight early. He instructs Flight 1455 to make a left turn to 190 degrees and descend to 6,000 feet. The first officer acknowledges this, and the pilots begin the descending turn toward a more southwesterly direction. At 6:03:30, just 30 seconds later, the controller also instructs Flight 1455 to maintain a speed of 230 knots or greater until advised. Look, speed restrictions are super common on approaches to busy airports. Keeping 1455 at 230 knots would increase the distance between them and the business jet behind, which was flying at 210 knots, the pilots aren't surprised. They just acknowledge the restriction and carry on. But here's the dangerous combination that's forming: high speed, heavy airplane, and shortcuts. Keep paying attention. The first officer calculates that the approach reference speed, or VREF, should be 133 knots at their current weight. Since the new weather report mentioned a 6-knot tailwind, company policy was to fly the approach at VRF plus 5 knots, which would mean 138 knots total. That meant they now had to lose almost 100 knots between their current position on the downwind and the final approach. But the controller didn't say how long this speed restriction would last, so it was unclear how much time the pilots would have to decelerate. Seconds later, the controller clears them to descend to 5,000 feet and to turn left onto a southeasterly heading of 160 degrees. This new heading put the aircraft on a course to intercept the approach track at just under 8 nautical miles from the runway threshold. 8 nautical miles, my friend? That was unusually close. In fact, this clearance cut about 6 miles from the expected approach track the pilots had in mind. That effectively eliminated any need for that 230-knot speed restriction, but for whatever reason, the controller just forgot to cancel it. And this is the moment where the pilots should have said, "Unable to comply with that clearance, we need more track miles, or at least can we fly slower?" But that didn't happen. And to understand why, we need to talk about two things: the stabilized approach concept and Southwest Airlines culture at the time. Let me explain something fundamental. Every airline in the world uses the stabilized approach concept to ensure that approaches only continue to a landing if all parameters indicate it's safe to do so. Southwest called this being in the slot. It means being on the glide path with airspeed within 10 knots of the calculated approach speed, a descent rate less than 1,000 feet per minute, flaps and gear extended, thrust levers in the correct position, and no major control inputs needed. The idea is, if the approach doesn't meet all those requirements at the stabilization gate, normally 1,000 feet on an instrument approach or 500 feet on a visual, the pilot must execute a go-around. But back in the early 2000s, these rules had gotten a little bit, shall we say, stretched at Southwest Airlines. Look, Southwest performed a very high rate of visual approaches, encouraging its pilots to do so whenever weather permitted. And in the southwestern US, that was most of the time. Visual approaches can be harder to stabilize due to the lack of automatic course guidance and higher workload, but they also often save time and fuel versus carrying out a full instrument approach. Southwest was very conscious of that. Because of this difficulty, it wasn't uncommon for Southwest pilots to find that one or two of those parameters weren't quite in the slot at the stabilization gate. And you know what they did? They corrected those parameters below 500 feet and landed the airplane anyway. Part of the reason this happened was that Southwest procedures didn't clearly state when exactly a go-around had to be performed. Most documents just said something like, "If you're not in the slot, you're not prepared for a normal landing," but didn't specify that a go-around had to be flown. And there's more. Many Southwest pilots also began to judge whether they were in the slot on a visual approach based on what the runway looked like to them, instead of strictly cross-checking all the required parameters. If it looked right to them, fine. But making the decision to land based on whether they subjectively believed they were in a position to make it was obviously totally contrary to the purpose of the stabilized approach concept, you know. An independent review of Southwest's culture would later reveal that these issues were part of a broader trend in which pilots at the airline were encouraged to complete any approach from which a landing was judged to be possible, regardless of whether it was a good idea or not. Southwest's culture was also found to emphasize a fast pace of operations, often featuring hot and high slam-dunk approaches to save time and fuel, and many Southwest pilots even believed that making aggressive visual approaches under very challenging circumstances was a way to develop and maintain good piloting skills. Can you believe that? I want to be clear here. Southwest wasn't the only airline during that time that encouraged that kind of mindset, but it's also true that this kind of culture increased the level of risk by encouraging pilots to practice difficult scenarios with passengers on board. Challenging approaches can indeed help keep skills sharp, but in general, it's better to confine this type of practice to the simulator so as not to endanger paying passengers, who, I guarantee you, would not vote for their flight being riskier than absolutely necessary. This behavior exemplifies one of what we in aviation call the 5 hazardous attitudes, specifically the attitude known as macho. Macho means an I-can-do-it attitude, with a tendency to show off or a need to prove oneself in the eyes of others, sometimes by taking risks or completing difficult challenges. According to that independent review, Southwest Airlines also didn't do enough to mitigate the risks of this operating style, because its training program failed to include adequate techniques for managing the aircraft's energy state during visual approaches, and it also didn't emphasize the need to properly brief those approaches. Try to remember both of those points, because they're going to become quite relevant soon. Back on board Flight 1455, the pilots accept the new heading of 160 degrees, and the captain reminds the first officer that the controller wanted 230 knots or greater for a while. Neither pilot considers asking ATC for more track miles. And here's another point from that analysis. Southwest pilots were reluctant to tell air traffic control they were unable to complete a clearance, another classic macho trait. Less than a minute later, the controller calls up Flight 1455 again to mention the presence of Flight 1713, which is now at their 1 o'clock position, 12 miles out, turning inbound toward the approach and descending out of 4,600 feet. The controller also asks if they'd like to make a visual approach to runway 08 instead of an ILS approach. The first officer asks the captain if they should take that offer, provided they can get the traffic in sight. At the time, the aircraft is still in a layer of clouds, but they expect to break out into visual conditions quite soon. The captain tells the first officer they'll have to wait and see. Over the next minute, the pilots tell the cabin crew to prepare for arrival, while air traffic control informs them that Flight 1713 is now over Van Nuys at 3,000 feet. Van Nuys is that major general aviation airport I mentioned before, located 6 nautical miles west of the Burbank runway 08 threshold. Since it's one of the busiest general aviation airports in the world, it presents an obstacle to Burbank arrivals. The Van Nuys VOR, located at the north end of the field, was a major landmark on the runway 08 approach, and the minimum altitude over that beacon was set at 3,000 feet to keep airliners above the Van Nuys traffic pattern. The approach path of runway 08 actually crosses over the southern tip of Van Nuys runway, but airliners approaching Burbank can still descend below 3,000 feet there, provided they're performing an instrument approach, because separation from the ILS glide slope is baked into Van Nuys traffic procedures. Suddenly, Flight 1455 breaks through the clouds, and the first officer announces they can see Van Nuys Airport ahead. Seconds later, the captain calls out that he has Flight 1713 in sight, and the first officer reports this to the air traffic controller. In response, the controller clears Flight 1455 for a visual approach to runway 08, with a restriction to cross Van Nuys at 3,000 feet or above, since they're now not using an instrument landing system approach. But that instruction is a bit ambiguous, my friend. The official definition of an altitude restriction states that it's an altitude to be maintained until a specific point or time, but no specific end point was given here since they wouldn't end up flying over Van Nuys. A strict interpretation of this clearance might mean they could begin descending from 3,000 feet as soon as they passed abeam the Van Nuys VOR. But that's probably not what the controller meant. On the other hand, the captain later told investigators that he wanted to stay well clear of the general aviation traffic, so he interpreted this clearance to mean they could descend from 3,000 feet only after leaving the airspace immediately around Van Nuys Airport. But if they waited that long to descend, well then they'd end up well above the glide path, forcing them to play catch-up by descending really quickly, which would make it hard or even impossible to bleed off their excess speed. All of this could have been solved by just asking the controller to clarify what he meant, or even better, asking for a wider pattern. But that didn't happen. Because Southwest pilots did visual approaches whenever possible, it's likely that being above the glide path at this point, due to altitude restrictions over Van Nuys, was completely normal for these pilots. And it's worth pointing out that the 230-knot speed restriction had technically been cancelled by the crew receiving an approach clearance, but the controller never explicitly highlighted that. In fact, the captain didn't appear to realize they were free to slow down until almost a full minute after the approach clearance had been issued, by which time the flight was located 2 nautical miles abeam Van Nuys to the west. At that point, the captain extends the speed brake to start slowing down, while also beginning the left turn to align with the runway for final approach. The autopilot is still engaged at this point, and the pilots have to tune the frequency for the ILS localizer to help them align automatically. So as they approach the centerline, the autopilot now starts trying to capture the localizer. But because the controller had vectored them with such a tight intercept angle, the autopilot is unable to do this cleanly, and instead ends up overshooting the centerline to the right, before starting to correct back to the left over the southern end of Van Nuys. After regaining their approach centerline, the captain instructs the first officer to set flaps 5, the very first step in configuring the aircraft for landing. As a reference here, in my airline, aircraft have to be configured with a minimum of flaps 1, at least 10 nautical miles from the runway, and with the speed back to around 180 knots or so. But this aircraft was nowhere near that speed, and they were much closer. Shortly after, the Woodland controller gives them the frequency for Burbank Tower and hands them over to receive their landing clearance. The captain now orders the landing gear to be extended, which the first officer does, and the captain then disconnects the autopilot and assumes manual control, adding workload to this already complex situation. The first officer, meanwhile, calls up Burbank Tower and reports they're on a visual approach to runway 08. In response, the tower informs them the wind is now 210 degrees at 6 knots and then clears them to land. 6-knot tailwind. It's only now, with the plane located just 3 nautical miles from the threshold, that the captain starts their final descent from 3,000 feet. Taking into account the airport elevation of 720 feet, this meant that to land in the touchdown zone, they'd have to achieve a descent flight path angle of 7 degrees. 7 degrees, my friend, that's more than twice the normal approach angle. And losing that much altitude that quickly would also cause the airspeed to increase quite a lot, since the pilots would have to pitch down to do so. So from this point, it was probably physically impossible to decelerate to their calculated approach speed before reaching the runway. So this was the point at which the pilots should have definitely realized it wouldn't be possible to stabilize this approach, and therefore they should have just executed a nice, calm go-around. But instead, without discussing their precarious position at all, the captain just continues the approach, calling for flaps 15 and flaps 25 in quick succession. Around this time, he also glances down at his flight management display, which shows some performance data, and notices they have a 20-knot tailwind, way more than the 6 knots reported on the ground. The captain thinks this high tailwind must be why they have to use such a high descent rate, because the tailwind is causing a higher than normal ground speed. But in reality, their very high airspeed to begin with was the main cause of this problem, right? While the captain was probably used to starting the descent at this point, he wasn't used to doing it at such a high speed, which requires a higher descent rate to achieve the glide path due to the decreased time available. If he'd been fully configured and back at his approach speed here, this might still have been possible. But in the situation they were now in, it was not. The captain finds this confusing at first, but the tailwind now gives him a convenient explanation, and that tailwind was going to die down. This also causes him to conclude that the solution is to descend even quicker, into the area closer to the ground, where the tailwind was indeed less strong. So, flying manually, he now eyeballs the trajectory he'd need to reach the runway, and then puts the airplane into a very steep descent. Seconds later, the Ground Proximity Warning System, the GPWS, detects an unsafe ground closure rate, causing an automated voice to call out, sink rate, several times. But interestingly, neither pilot acknowledges this caution. Instead, the captain just says, flaps 30, just put it down. 3 seconds later, he then also adds, put it to 40, it won't go, I know that, it's all right. Final descent checklist. What he meant here was that they were actually flying above the flap limit speed for flaps 40. Every flap setting has a speed limit associated with it, above which using that flap setting could cause damage to the flap mechanisms. For this reason, the Boeing 737 has a flap load limiting system that doesn't allow the flaps to extend to 40 degrees unless the airspeed is below 158 knots. And since the captain knew they were above that speed, he also knew the flaps wouldn't actually reach 40 degrees until they had decelerated below it. In later interviews, the captain said he knew they were too fast, but couldn't recall what their actual airspeed was. But according to the flight data recorder, it was still around a terrifying 200 knots at this point. 200 knots, my friend? And it wasn't really decreasing at all due to the high descent angle. This meant that Flight 1455 was now descending on a very steep glide path with sink rate alerts blaring, and 60 knots above the approach reference speed. So where was the first officer in all of this? As the pilot monitoring, it was his responsibility to call out deviations from the stabilized approach parameters and also to suggest corrective actions, which in this case would have been to just execute a go-around. But he didn't. He later explained that he had heard the sink rate alert and had seen their high altitude and speed, but he consciously decided not to call this out because in his opinion, the captain was aware and already correcting. The problem with that mindset is that as pilot monitoring, he was required to make those call-outs regardless of whether he thought the captain was aware of the problem or not. Obviously, the first officer couldn't be inside the captain's head, and he also couldn't be sure the captain had the full impression of the situation. In fact, the whole reason the pilot monitoring is tasked with calling out deviations is that he has less workload than the pilot flying does and therefore likely a better overall picture of what's going on. So basically, the lesson here is that it doesn't matter why a first officer doesn't speak up. Whether he's afraid of the captain or because he thinks the captain is handling the situation, it's poor crew resource management either way, and the consequences will end up being exactly the same. As it turned out in this situation, the captain wasn't handling it at all. And to understand why, we need to look at what he was actually focused on during the descent and the minutes leading up to it. One way to conceptualize his decision-making is by identifying what it was that made him feel so comfortable that he could make it, despite evidence to the contrary. And what seems to have happened here was that every time he needed to make a decision, some small thing happened that rewarded his choice to continue. Like I mentioned before, at first the crew had expected to land on the less familiar runway 33, but then the wind had died down and the runway was changed over to 08, which in the pilots' minds made things much, much easier. Next they descended out of the clouds and caught sight of both the runway and the airplane ahead of them, allowing the pilots to quickly assess that they could make a visual approach. Then, during the final descent, when the captain noticed he needed to use an abnormally steep descent rate, he realized there was a 20-knot tailwind at altitude, causing them to move faster, so he concluded this problem could be solved by quickly descending to a lower altitude, where the reported tailwind was much lower. Having decided that, he then visually assessed their position relative to the runway and concluded the picture looked relatively normal to him. Yes, they were definitely a bit high and fast, but he'd probably been high and fast on this approach before, and he'd always landed without any problems. But what the captain obviously didn't consider was that at their current airspeed and with their high gross weight, the energy state of the aircraft was now super high, even though the view of the runway ahead, in his opinion at least, didn't look that bad. He also didn't consider that he was about to try to land this heavy, fast-moving aircraft onto a relatively short runway, only about 6,000 feet, which was still wet from recent rain, and which also had absolutely no safety margin at the far end, just a blast fence, and then the city. This is actually a perfect example of why it can be so dangerous to normalize risky behavior and routinely disregard warnings. Because when the sink rate caution sounded, it also failed to bring him out of his complacency because he was using a high sink rate on purpose to get out of the tailwind and regain the flight path. And if we're being totally honest here, he probably had heard sink rate alarms before, again given the frequent use of steep visual approaches. So by this point, having convinced himself that he actually was in a position to land, his main concern now became the spacing between his aircraft and the other Southwest flight ahead of them. They had slowed down in a normal manner, so Flight 1455 was now starting to catch up with them due to their high speed. And that concerned the captain a bit, since it looked like the slower flight might not be able to clear the runway in time for him to land. That distraction just added to his loss of situational awareness here, where no matter how good he thought the visual picture was, he just didn't appreciate that the real problem he was now facing was his own aircraft's high kinetic energy and the lack of runway ahead of them. Here's another important point. Southwest 737s were equipped with an onboard performance computer, capable of calculating their landing distance given certain parameters. And Southwest's standard operating procedures called for the pilots to use that computer whenever the performance capabilities of the aircraft were in question, like when landing on a short runway with tailwind or landing with high gross weights, all of which were present here. But because they were convinced this was just another normal approach into Burbank, neither of the pilots seemed to have considered using this computer to calculate their proper landing distance. If they had done so, they would have seen just how tight the landing distance actually was, even with the correct approach speed, and the danger they were now in would maybe have become a little more apparent. But without that information, yet another hole in the slices of the Swiss cheese model had now opened up. Anyway, immediately after the captain had called for flaps 40, the first officer pointed to the airspeed indicator to remind the captain that the flaps would be inhibited, but he still didn't call out their actual airspeed or any reservations about what was happening. He then also responded to the captain's call for the final descent checklist by visually verifying the required items, even though this was supposed to be a challenge and response checklist requiring both pilots to participate. Look, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel like you have to do this, where the other pilot is too busy to take part in the checklist, that's a clear indication that the workload is now so high that you need to do something. Likely go around. As the GPWS kept calling out, sink rate in the background, the first officer now verifies they're clear to land and also notifies the flight attendants to get seated for landing. Moments later, the sink rate caution is now also joined by an even more serious warning. Beeping. Pull up! Pull up! Today, we pilots are taught to respond to this warning by immediately executing a terrain escape maneuver, regardless of whether we have the runway in sight or not. But at Southwest Airlines and many other airlines at that time, pilots were instead taught that if they were flying in visual conditions with the runway clearly in sight and it was possible to verify with complete confidence that there was no threat of collision with the terrain, well then this warning could potentially be disregarded. That mindset is, in my opinion, quite strange, because unless the possibility of a false GPWS alert is mentioned in an airport briefing or on a chart, then hearing this warning means something is definitely seriously wrong, regardless of whether the runway is visible or not. In this particular case, Flight 1455 was now descending so fast that the plane sensed it was outside the normal approach envelope, so the GPWS believed the flight path was leading toward a ground collision rather than a landing. Later, the captain said he never heard the pull-up call-outs at all, which I guess could be possible because of the stress he was experiencing. But the first officer said he did hear them, but believed the flight path was safe and that the captain was correcting. Again, a very strange thing to hear from a competent pilot monitoring. It would actually have been quite interesting to hear at exactly what point this first officer would have thought it was appropriate to intervene. Anyway, as the warnings continued to blare, Flight 1455 blasted through the stabilization gate at 500 feet without a word from either of the pilots. The plane was now descending at more than 1,000 feet per minute, with an airspeed 50 knots above the approach reference speed, and with the flaps still not extended to the landing configuration. The captain later also acknowledged he should have performed a go-around at this point, but explained that he became fixated on the runway. And this kind of fixation or tunnel vision can arise when we're working hard to achieve a concrete, visible goal, especially if that goal is challenging to achieve. This is actually known as get-there-itis in the industry, and it's especially common among captains. And this is why we really need a strong, assertive first officer to snap us out of it. But that obviously wasn't happening here. Meanwhile, up ahead of them, Flight 1713 had now cleared the runway, removing what the captain perceived as the last obstacle in his way. The GPWS continued to sound numerous times as they streaked toward the runway, but the captain just said, "That's all right," and the first officer said nothing at all. At a height of 170 feet, the captain starts raising the nose to flare for touchdown. Just to give you some reference, we normally flare at around 25 to 30 feet. And 9 seconds after he had started the flare, they touched down on runway 08 at the incredible speed of 182 knots. 182 knots. Due to the high speed and steep approach, the touchdown occurred 2,150 feet beyond the threshold, well outside the normal touchdown zone, located between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. Immediately upon touchdown, the captain activates the thrust reversers, and then he begins manual braking much earlier than he normally would in order to help the plane start decelerating as quickly as possible. But calculations later show that, with the prevailing runway conditions, weight and speed, even with maximum manual braking, it would have taken 4,700 feet to bring the speeding plane down to a stop, and they only had 4,150 feet of runway left. This meant that from the moment the captain selected the reverse thrust, any possibility of a go-around went out the window, and a crash became inevitable. The 737 begins to decelerate. The flaps finally extend to 40 degrees, but it's now too late to make any real difference. Onlookers at Burbank's nearby passenger terminal watch in horror as the plane hurtles past, clearly moving way too fast to be able to stop within the remaining runway. In the cockpit, the two pilots have now noticed they aren't slowing down fast enough, and their nonchalance now finally turns into concern, followed by cold, raw fear. The captain now clearly realizes what's about to happen. He can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder, cursing at himself in third person, and he has good reasons for doing that. Because beyond the end of runway 08, there isn't a long, grassy, clear way like on other runways. Instead, there are just 32 feet of open concrete, followed by a solid blast wall designed to deflect jet blast away from the traffic on North Hollywood Way, which runs directly past the threshold of runway 26. When the captain sees this wall rapidly approaching, he uses his nosewheel tiller to steer to the right, aiming across the ramp and toward the open airport fence to avoid collision with the blast wall. But using the tiller in this way while braking just puts the airplane into a skid, which reduces brake effectiveness even further. At 6:11:20 p.m., Flight 1455 clips the right edge of the blast wall and then careens through the perimeter fence at a speed of 32 knots, about 37 miles per hour. The nose gear collapses as the plane then slides across 7 traffic lanes on North Hollywood Way, where it collides with one car and then sends debris flying into several others. And on the opposite side of the street is something taken straight out of a nightmare, a gas station, dead ahead. For a split second, it seems as though Flight 1455 will end up in a deadly fireball, but then the 737 miraculously comes to a stop right on the edge of the gas station's parking lot underneath the big sign advertising the price per gallon, a picture I'm sure many of you have seen. There wasn't really time for recovery attempts here. Once the captain put in reverse thrust with the aircraft at that speed and in that position on the runway, physics took over. But what I can tell you is that the captain demonstrated considerable skill in managing to swerve away from the blast wall and avoid a head-on collision that could have been catastrophic. That last-second maneuver, even though it collapsed the landing gear, probably saved lives. They never gave up. They fought until the last second. The aircraft was substantially damaged, but the cabin and cockpit were intact. All passengers and crew had miraculously survived the crash. On the nearby road, several cars had been damaged in the crash, but incredibly, none of their occupants was seriously hurt either. Inside the cockpit, the captain must have now felt a wave of clarity wash over him as he emerged from his previously fixated state, because he now just said, "My fault." And then he added that phrase that would become famous. "Well, there goes my career." Back in the cabin, the R1 escape slide had inflated inside the galley area during the crash and was now blocking access to the forward exit doors. But fortunately, the passengers had been able to evacuate through the rear and overwing exits. If there had been a fire, this would have been a serious problem. But thankfully there was none. So in the end, all 137 passengers and 5 crew members evacuated safely. Only 2 passengers suffered serious injuries, while 41 passengers and the captain sustained minor injuries. Listen to this. The control tower took 30 seconds to call the fire department. 30 seconds after a commercial airplane crashed through the airport fence and slid across a busy avenue. Let me be very clear with you about what really caused this accident. First, the flight crew's failure to go around at the stabilization gate despite excessive speed and a steep flight path angle. The pilots had multiple opportunities to go around when they received the tight vectors. When they realized they were too fast. When the GPWS started alerting. When they reached 500 feet completely outside parameters, but they chose not to. Second, The controller's use of speed and altitude restrictions that unnecessarily put Flight 1455 into a position from which a safe approach could not be made. That tight vector with intercept at only 8 nautical miles, combined with the 230-knot speed restriction that was never explicitly cancelled, created a situation where stabilizing the approach was extremely difficult, if not impossible. But here's the thing. The pilots never said unable. They accepted the clearance and tried to make it work. Third, Southwest Airlines' operational culture that normalized aggressive approaches and discouraged go-arounds. That independent review commissioned by the Airline Pilots Association found widespread cultural problems at Southwest that encouraged pilots to attempt risky approaches without taking due care. Southwest pilots were encouraged to make visual approaches whenever possible to save time and fuel. They were encouraged to complete any approach from which they judged a landing to be possible. They developed the habit of judging whether they were in the slot, based on what the runway looked like, instead of rigorously checking all parameters. And you know what's worse? Many Southwest pilots believed that making aggressive visual approaches under very challenging circumstances was a way to develop and maintain good piloting skills. Can you believe that? Fourth, failures in Southwest's training program. The training program failed to include adequate techniques for managing the aircraft's energy state during visual approaches. It didn't emphasize the need to properly brief those approaches. And it didn't make clear when exactly a go-around had to be executed. Fifth, the first officer's lack of assertiveness. As pilot monitoring, it was the first officer's responsibility to call out deviations from stabilized approach parameters and suggest corrective actions. He saw the high speed, he heard the GPWS alerts, he knew they were outside parameters. But he consciously chose not to speak up because he believed the captain was aware and correcting. That's poor crew resource management. Period. Sixth, the captain's fixation on the runway. The captain later admitted he became fixated on the runway. He developed what we call get-there-itis, that compulsion to complete the task no matter what. Every little thing that happened reinforced his decision to continue. The runway changed to the more familiar OS-8, breaking out of the clouds and spotting the runway, having an explanation for the high sink rate. Everything seemed to be conspiring to tell him it was okay, but it wasn't. Seventh, the failure to use the onboard performance computer. Southwest procedures required pilots to use the performance computer whenever the aircraft's performance capabilities were in question. They were landing on a short runway, with tailwind, with high gross weight. All those factors were present. If they had used that computer, they would have seen how tight the margin really was. But they didn't use it because they were convinced this was just another normal approach into Burbank. Do you agree that all these factors came together to create the perfect accident? So, what did the industry learn from this accident? After the accident, the Federal Aviation Administration suspended both pilots' licenses for 1 year. And as the captain had predicted, both were then also fired from Southwest Airlines. The NTSB found that the cause of the accident was the flight crew's failure to go around at the stabilization gate despite excessive speed and a steep flight path angle. But that independent review went further. It found that Southwest had a culture that normalized risky behavior, a culture that pressured pilots to complete difficult approaches, a culture that made pilots reluctant to say, unable to air traffic control. And you know what happened next? In 2005, another Southwest flight overran the runway at Chicago's Midway Airport and slid onto a street. In that accident, which I actually covered on this channel a while back, the flight crew decided to land at Midway, despite very unfavorable conditions due to perceived pressure to complete the task. After each accident, Southwest implemented reforms to its procedures and training to improve its safety culture. And these types of incidents have since become much, much less common. But we shouldn't forget that if the plane had touched down just a little farther along or a little faster, it might have plowed into that gas station with catastrophic results. That's why, after this accident, Burbank Airport actually bought the gas station and another nearby business and replaced them with empty lots to prevent that scenario from ever occurring. The airport also equipped the departure end of runway 08 with an engineered materials arrestor system, or EMAS, which stops runaway aircraft using specially engineered gravel underneath a breakable surface. And in 2018, This very EMAS installation stopped another Southwest flight from running off Burbank's runway 08, proving just how valuable these systems are at airports where no proper clear way is possible. Isn't it awesome to see safety work in action? Look, my friend, aviation is built on the concept of learning from mistakes. Every accident, every incident, every near miss teaches us something new about how to fly more safely. But sometimes the lessons are hard. Sometimes they expose deep cultural problems that nobody wants to admit exist. Southwest was a successful airline, efficient, profitable, loved by passengers. But beneath that veneer of success was a culture that was pushing its pilots closer and closer to the edge, and eventually someone was going to cross that line. Fortunately, in this case, everyone survived to tell the tale, but it didn't have to be that way. That gas station was just feet away. As pilots, we have to remember that our first responsibility is safety, not efficiency, not profit, not looking cool to our colleagues, safety. And if that means saying unable to air traffic control, then we say unable. If that means executing a go-around when we're not in the slot, then we go around. No excuses, no exceptions, because at the end of the day, we want to be able to look in the mirror and know we did the right thing. We don't want to be standing next to a gas station saying, well, there goes my career. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think an airline's culture can really influence pilots' decisions that much? This is Captain Sergio Marchetti. Thank you for being my co-pilot on this investigation. I'll see you on the next flight. Until then, fly safe.